What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time? All right, Reggie, so good to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Well, great to be with you, Ryan.
So to start, I really liked the section of your book when you talked about the difference between a coach, a mentor, and a sponsor. Can you delineate between those three and why all three are important?
Absolutely. You know, and I will give full disclosure. The three thoughts are things that I've picked up from a variety of different individuals. So I have no claim of ownership of the concept, but I thought that it really highlights the different types of people that you need to help you be successful, whether it's in a business career, whether it's as an apprentice learning a trade. It really struck home for me. So, a coach, think of the proverbial batting coach. So this is someone who's done it before, knows what to do, and helps you with the details of the work. And it's leveraging their own experience. It's leveraging their in-depth knowledge of the material is what a coach is and why a coach is so important early in your career or as you transition to new roles and you're needing to learn new skills. A mentor is someone that you build a relationship with, someone who gives you perspective, maybe gives you alternative ways of thinking about a problem or situation. I believe that the best mentor-mentee relationships happen organically, even though as a business person, I put mentor-type programs in place, but really it served as a jumping off point for people to connect and to build these types of relationships. The person doesn't need to be an expert in what it is that you do. It's best when they're not in your reporting line, but it's truly a trusted advisor giving perspective and where you could bounce off ideas. To me, that's the concept of a mentor. And then a sponsor. And so sponsors are most critical. The more senior you get in your career or the more senior you get in your craft, these are the people who talk about you when you're not in the room. These are the people who give, who sing your praises, essentially, about the great work that you do or the great approach that you do. And so these people are just critically important as you continue to progress in your own craft. So that's how I think about the three different roles and why each is just so important for you to be effective no matter what it is that you do.
You obviously had you are still in the middle of it, just in a different chapter, but an amazing career where you got promoted and promoted and promoted. And I think the only way that happens first and foremost is you got to do amazing work and achieve results and impact people in a positive way. But you had to have some sponsors that were there for you. Can you think of a story or a moment where a sponsor helped elevate you, spoke kindly behind your back when you weren't in the room, and helped put you in a position to get one of the many big roles that you've had in your career?
Sure. So, and I named the person in my book, an executive by the name of Bob Gayle. I worked for Bob or within his organization for many years when I was at Procter & Gamble. And he was both a mentor and a sponsor. A mentor in terms of an individual who I went to for perspective and advice. But in the sponsorship role, I was at a point where I was frustrated with my time at Procter & Gamble. At the time, P&G only promoted from within. So you were hired, right into the organization. People were then promoted and progressed. and you could see your peers getting promoted potentially in front of you, and that would cause some individuals to then leave the company, figuring that their time had come and passed. And I was in a situation where I saw peers being promoted to a critical level within P&G in my function, and that was the brand manager within the brand management function, a role that you would typically get promoted into when I was with the company sometime around your 3.5 year mark with the company. And here I am approaching 3.5 years. I'm seeing people get promoted. I'm frustrated. And I went on some external job interviews. And Bob called me to his home, a home that he was in the process of demolishing so that he could use the foundation and other reclaimable parts to build his new home onto. And we had a fabulous and insightful conversation. And what it reinforced for me was that, unbeknownst to me, he was singing my praises. He was having conversations with more senior levels of Procter & Gamble and really thinking through what would be the best role for me in that critical first-time brand manager job. And in the end, I ended up being promoted shortly after this conversation. I ended up being promoted into Bob's organization, which was probably what the holdup was. They were trying to find the right role. But when you're an executive, you don't know that any of this is going on. You don't know these conversations are happening because you're not there. And so it just highlights how critically important it is to have these people singing your praises and having, eventually access to that information. It is important to know who these sponsors are and to know that they're doing these types of sponsorship types of activities on your behalf. If it hadn't been for that situation, that conversation, I probably would have left Procter & Gamble before becoming a brand manager. And candidly, my career probably would have looked very different.
What was it about you? What were you doing that made Bob sing your praises in rooms where you weren't?
I am an unconventional thinker, or more accurately, a lateral thinker, meaning I'm constantly looking around for examples, people doing things well, people doing things maybe not so well. I'm constantly scanning and bringing those types of ideas back to the position that I'm in to apply these initiatives that in many cases have never been done before in that particular environment. So the lateral nature of my thinking, the constant push for innovation, I think is what Bob saw as highly desired and something he wanted in his organization. And it's something that I continue to do. I'm constantly looking across the landscape of different industries and different brands, different organizations, looking to steal their best ideas and apply them to the situations that I find myself in.
What exactly? So I've heard Shane Snow on this podcast has talked about the idea of lateral thinking, but can you give an example so we can make this real? Because if we make it real, then hopefully others could take it and do it themselves. What's a way we could be lateral thinkers, or a very specific example of this taking place that either you've done or you've seen somebody else do?
Sure. Well, and so this is another story from my book, but I talk about when I am at Nintendo. And at this point, with the company about 3.5 years, I've just been promoted from being the head of sales and marketing to being president of the largest subsidiary of Nintendo, and that's specifically the Nintendo of America subsidiary, which has responsibility for Canada, the US, all of Latin America. It represents, even today, about 50% of the global sales and profit for Nintendo. So newly promoted, we're about to launch a new gaming console called the Wii. And many people remember the Wii. It had this one-handed controller that you would swing your hand like you're playing tennis with a racket, or swing it to hit a baseball like you're swinging a bat. And so we're preparing to launch this new system. And I had seen a game called Wii Sports that used 5 different sports and really had a great orientation and introduction to this Wii remote. And what was going through my head was, how do we make Wii a cultural phenomenon? And you know, we've all seen cultural phenomenons, whether they're brand new products or musical acts. You know, in 2006, you know, the iPhone was just about to become a cultural phenomenon. And so what I was trying to do was to come up with an idea that would help the Wii truly become a cultural phenomenon. And I saw this software, Wii Sports, being critical to do that. But in order for you to have a cultural phenomenon, you need people to have access to the content and to be able to talk about it in, you know, positive and glowing terms. So I pushed the organization at Nintendo that we should include Wii Sports within the overall proposition for Wii, meaning that in the Americas and in Europe, when you bought a Wii console, you automatically got Wii Sports. And it was a very difficult sale to the organization, because essentially I was asking the company to forego, you know, $50 in revenue for every game that was being sold. Video games are highly profitable once you amortize the development costs. So this was a very difficult sale within the company, but I was convinced that this is what we needed to do. And eventually the company agreed. We included Wii Sports in my territory as well as in Europe. It was not included in Japan, which created a really good A/B test. And it worked. I mean, it created the cultural phenomenon that was Wii. People were playing with the Wii system in retirement homes and bars, on cruise ships. That was only possible, and it only happened in these territories where we included Wii Sports in the overall proposition. So, you know, lateral thinking beyond the obvious, you know, taking different thoughts and melding them together to come up with a whole new idea. And in this case, it was a magical success.
How did it do in Japan?
So interestingly, right, the platform did okay in Japan, because Nintendo is truly a market leader in the Japanese home market, but it just wasn't the same. It wasn't the same cultural phenomenon that we were able to get in all of the other territories. And in the end, even the senior most executives at global Nintendo acknowledged that by including Wii Sports, it was absolutely the right decision, and it was a bit of a missed opportunity in the home market of Japan.
I want to go back to earlier in your life. You wrote a story about your mom. You were younger. You and your brother would each get a quarter to go pick up a copy of the newspaper for your parents. And one day, some teenagers stole your money. What lesson did you learn that day from your mom?
Yeah, so, you know, the title of my book, or subtitle, From the Bronx to the Top of Nintendo. So this was my time living in the Bronx. And, you know, the Bronx historically has always been a challenged area. Even today, if based on census data, greatest amount of child poverty, greatest amount of food insecurity. So it's a very challenged area, and was back then in the early 60s. And I was, you know, about 4 years old. My brother was 2 years older. And as you said, Ryan, we'd go get the Sunday daily news from my parents. And we were mugged by a couple teenagers. And I need to put this in perspective. I'm tall. My brother's tall. We were pretty rough kids, even at 4 and 6. But there was no way we were going to get into a fight with kids in their early teenage years or preteen years. And so we run home, tell my mother what happened. She's incensed. I mean, she's absolutely incensed. And, my parents emigrated to the US from Haiti. They were college educated in Haiti, but in moving to the US, they didn't speak English, so had to take on some fairly menial jobs. But there was no way she was going to allow her sons to get mugged. And so she marches us down back to the bodega where this happened. We point out the two kids who stole our money, and they take off running, figuring that they're just going to get away from my incensed mother and her, two young children. But my mother just takes off and starts running after them. And so, of course, we have to run after her. And we run 5 blocks. We finally get, the kids must tire, but now they're in front of a different tenement building with a group of young Black men sitting around. And probably, this is probably their home tenement building. And now we've got a bit of a commotion, because now, these kids have stopped. They're talking to these men. They asked my mother, what's going on? Or actually, they asked the kid, what's going on? The kid says, this crazy ass woman is chasing us. My mother says, it's because you stole from my sons. And the leader of the men that was in front of this tenement building, looks at the kids, looks at us, and just says to the kids, give me the money. And they produce the 50 cents, the 2 quarters, hand it over to this man. This man gives it to my mom. She turns on her heel, walks away. We're scared to death, wondering what's going to happen next. But we walk back the 5 blocks, pick up the paper, go back to my apartment. What's the learning? The learning is truly, it is always about right and wrong. It is always about doing the right thing, always doing the right thing. And, in this case, my mother was not going to allow us to have had that type of experience. She was going to look to make things right. Certainly it's not what I would recommend in this day and age. Certainly culture has moved on, and things are a bit more challenging in this day and age. I wouldn't recommend kids walking to a bodega block and a half at ages 4 and 6. I wouldn't recommend chasing after someone who's mugged you. But at the time, it was a critical learning for me of, you got to do the right thing, and you need to understand right and wrong.
Love the story, and it's written really well in the book too. Disrupting the Game, obviously people should pick up the book, because pretty much all my notes are pulled from it, and there's so much more than we're going to even cover today. But one of the other areas, and we're going to bounce a bit, is the value of the perfect memo. And you said everything at P&G, Procter & Gamble, moved forward based on ideas or initiatives distilled on one piece of paper. And this has become probably famous too because of Jeff Bezos's 6-page handout as opposed to using PowerPoint. And I've been beating the drum, Reggie, for years about the value of writing, and especially from a leadership perspective, because it getting something from your mind to the page, whether you handwrite it or you type it, creates clarity of thought. And great leaders are clear thinkers. Can you share more about your experiences and the value of the perfect memo and why leaders need to become efficient and, I think, excellent writers?
Well, first off, I completely agree that the practice of writing drives a clarity of thought. It drives a clarity of communication. It drives a persuasiveness that you can capture and communicate. And, at Procter and Gamble, truly, it was all about writing this perfect memo, this memo that started with a clarity of a stated objective. And I was constantly on this point throughout all of my career, especially my time at Nintendo, where before any meeting would start, I would make sure that we had clarity on what's the purpose, why are we here, what is the objective, and having the clarity of objective or the clarity of outcome right at the beginning just drives a focus in how you should move forward, whether it's in crafting the memo or in conducting a meeting. So a clarity of objective, a clarity of the proposal that you're putting in front of people, and then the rationale. And at Procter and Gamble, the rationale was always 3. And to this day, I still speak in 3s. And early in my career at Procter and Gamble, I asked the question, why 3? Why do we only have 3 recommendations? Or why do we have only 3 key takeaways from a piece of research? And I was told, Reggie, 1 or 2 isn't compelling enough, and 4 or more is overkill. So 3 is the perfect number. And that's, that thought stuck with me. So 3 key points that summarize, why you're doing something, that have to be persuasive, that have to be clear in their intent. And then every one-page memo at P&G would summarize then the next steps. Where do you go from here? What are you asking for? Are you asking for money? Are you asking for a specific change in approach or method, whatever the case may be, but a clarity of next steps. And this construct really, it has stuck with me for 40 years, and it's driven not only an approach, but a focus on clarity, compelling, persuasive communication that I believe every leader needs to have. And it needs to be not only in written form, but then from a verbal perspective as well.
I would imagine writing all of that time, basically your whole career, made you a much better speaker, as evidenced by what you're doing right now, as well as put you in a position to write a really good book because you've got so many reps over the years, right?
So here's what's interesting. I do believe that my 8 years at Procter and Gamble drove a clarity of writing, business writing, and thinking. What I would also say, though, is, my next big career chunk was with Pizza Hut, a division at the time of PepsiCo. And that company is all about presentations. It's about stand-up presentations. And so that really honed my presentation skills and my public speaking skills. I had to give presentations in front of thousands of franchisees, for example, and to be compelling at a very young age in a boardroom type setting. And then the third piece I would highlight, so it's written communication, verbal communication, but then at Nintendo, I learned the art of nonverbal communication.
Oh.
And that's because the way that organization did business in a meeting type setup, it was sequential translation, meaning an executive from the Japanese parent company would say something in Japanese. It would get translate it into English. I would respond in English, and then that would get translated into Japanese. But during the translation elements, you don't capture body language. You don't capture, is the person smiling, frowning? Are they happy? Are they upset? And so you need to learn when that first communication is happening in a language that you don't understand. What's the intent, or what are all the nonverbal cues that are being communicated, so that when it's then translated back into English, it helps fill out the entire communication.
Wow. I mean, what a great way to develop such necessary skills, both written, verbal, and then understanding kind of the emotional intelligence aspect of body language and people. I never thought of it that way with the translation, but that makes a lot of sense because there's also a delay. So you're seeing the kind of response as they're hearing it. Your words are repeated in another language and you can watch in real time as opposed to seeing them to you. I think that would be really interesting. Reggie, I want to go back to a part in your career when you messed up. I think we learned so much from times where maybe in this case you overstep authority. This is the Crisco story at P&G. Can you take us back to that moment and what happened and what you've learned from it?
Absolutely. So at this point, I am a well-tenured brand manager, likely looking at the next level promotion. At the time, they called that role an associate advertising manager. So I was well seasoned. One of my personal traits, I am by nature very aggressive. I'm aggressive in my thinking. I'm constantly pushing new ideas forward. I want to see growth. I want to see growth now. And with all that as a backdrop, I'm now on a brand that I had worked on before, earlier in my career, Crisco shortening. And the benefit of having worked on that business is I knew a lot of the business drivers. I knew a lot of the people working around the brand and the business. And I was very eager to put in place initiatives that would create growth on this business. In the time that I had left Crisco shortening, the business had declined as consumers were eating out more frequently or using other fats and oils in their food preparation habits. So I'm aggressive. I want to move the business forward. As I was joining this business, the team that was in place had just created some stellar consumer advertising. It was emotional. It motivated you to learn more about the product. We had experimented with having a 1-800 number that consumers could call to get recipes that use Crisco shortening. And again, I need to put this in perspective. This is the late 1980s. So internet really didn't exist yet. So, a predominant form of direct-to-consumer type of marketing was through advertising and having a direct response mechanism of including a 1-800 number. Well, this advertising was fabulous. It moved the business in all of our testing. And we were preparing to launch the advertising going into the key holiday cooking, baking season in October. But in my aggressive push, I asked the advertising agency and the media buying agency to actually start running the advertising earlier in the month of September. Now, for people listening to this podcast, they say to themselves, what kind of difference can a couple weeks make? Well, by spending it in a different quarter, different fiscal quarter for the company, And there's always a lag effect in any type of marketing activity. Essentially, what I did is I spent money in a quarter that was unplanned, and the business results didn't happen until the following quarter. So I created a financial loss for my brand and for my division. This is a huge deal in the P&G culture. The fact that I did this on my own authorization, the fact that it created a financial loss for the company, this was a huge deal. And what's interesting is I think about this often, and I ask myself the question, so why didn't I write one of those perfect one-page memos? Why didn't I, work it properly? But I was eager and I was aggressive. I was convinced I was right, and I did it. And it's also a testimony that the agency and the media company trusted me, that they went ahead and did what I asked them to do. Well, this was a huge issue, right? Creating a financial loss in a quarter for the company, for my division, not for the entire company, but for my division. And leadership wanted to fire the advertising agency and the media company. I finally wrote that perfect one-page memo saying that I took full responsibility, that if anyone was to be fired, it was going to be me. I wasn't, but I knew that at that point, my career at Procter & Gamble was over. And I left. I ended up getting that promotion that I so desperately wanted, but I probably left the company within 18 months after that experience. And so, it was a crushing blow at the time, leaving a company that I was on a very successful track, over the course of eight and a half years. But it was also a very critical lesson for me in terms of, what is the right way to align support, to get the organization behind you in moving a proposal forward. Those were all lessons that I learned the hard way from that critical mistake.
What is that? Just your nature was to be aggressive, like let's go, and that's what you acted upon, or what?
Absolutely. That was exactly it. It was, let's go. I'm convinced that I'm right. I don't want to spend the time and energy convincing my organization that this is the right thing to do. And there was a time pressure as well, because I wanted to have good momentum going into that key holiday cooking, baking season. And I imagine at the time that I said to myself that I just didn't have the time, if you will, to do it the right way. And hence push the trigger.
Let's fast forward a bit. Nintendo comes after you. How did this whole the part that it was interesting in the book is along the way, when you're working these big time jobs, you're a gamer. I mean, you're playing video game. You're working all day, working on big things, and then all of a sudden at night, whether it's Zelda or Mario Brothers with the perfect score, and I mean, I'm not as adept, but I mean, I love those games too. I would play them growing up, but I think I stopped shortly after college, and I was mainly playing like Madden or games like that. But you're a gamer, so this has to feel like a dream job in a sense. But they come after you. Can you share a bit about that process for you to get the role at Nintendo, your first role at Nintendo?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. I played, the early video game systems as a teenager. During college, I played more pinball than video games. Just at Cornell University, there was an area with all of these pinball machines, and myself and a number of good friends, we would go there and do that, before a party or something else happening later that evening. But in the early 90s, I re-engaged with video games with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. So this was Nintendo's second system. The first one they launched globally was the original Nintendo Entertainment System. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System came thereafter. And beginning with that moment and, those games, I was constantly playing games. I would learn later that, my collection of, almost 80 Super Nintendo video games, I was a super user of the system because the average consumer only had, about 7 or 8 games. So I was an avid player, played on not only Nintendo systems, but Sony systems, as well as, Microsoft. Just before I was approached to join Nintendo, Microsoft had entered the video game space with their original Xbox. So I felt I had a really strong understanding of the industry from a consumer perspective. Right before joining Nintendo, I was working at VH1, a division of MTV Networks, part of the Viacom empire. So I had a good understanding of the entertainment space from that experience. And Nintendo came calling. And I had pages and pages of notes, things that I wanted to learn more about, things that I would do differently. Again, my lateral thinking approach, taking examples from a variety of different industries and having suggestions for how Nintendo could do things differently. And I progressed well in the interviews and was offered the role. But before accepting the role, I asked to meet with the global president, a gentleman by the name of Satoru Iwata, who had been in the role at that point, maybe about 18 months, 16 months, something like that. And the reason I asked to meet with him was that I knew that Nintendo of America was the largest subsidiary. I knew that they were looking for an executive who would push the organization, who would have new and unique points of view, would drive different initiatives. And I knew that in order to be successful in that type of role where you're pushing the company to do things differently, I knew that I needed to have a strong working relationship with Satoru Iwata. Essentially, I needed him to be a sponsor. Yep. I needed him to be someone saying that, this new executive has really good ideas, we should support him. And I asked to meet with him before taking the job. And I later learned that this was highly controversial, that it almost cost me the job. Wow. Because the organization is saying, who's this brash American? Who's this guy who thinks that he can have a video conference with our global president who has much more important things to do? But we met. We were to have a 30-minute conversation, ended up being much, much longer than that. And it solidified our relationship. And he would continue to be a very close and dear boss and mentor and friend for over 10 years. He passed away in 2015 from a form of cancer. But that meeting, asking for the meeting, getting the meeting, building the relationship with Satoru Iwata, again, a critical ask, a critical decision that set me up for the balance of my career at Nintendo.
It seems like good advice for somebody, especially if you're approached or they want you. It seems reasonable to me to want to get to know senior leaders, especially if it's for a leadership role at the company. But it was controversial at the time. Is that because there's just cultural differences, or do you think that's more normal now with an American company, or how would it be today for someone going for a senior level leadership role to ask this, to meet with the CEO or a senior C-suite level person?
Certainly culture, business culture played a role in the controversy. Yeah. And to be clear, Mr. Iwata was my two-level boss. So he wasn't my direct boss. He was a two-level boss.
Sure.
That created a bit of the controversy. But Ryan, to your point, I do believe in any interview process, there's a transition that's made from when you are selling yourself, your skills, your capabilities. You know, a good friend of mine, executive recruiter, always taught me, right? Step one, you got to get the offer. So you're selling yourself to get the job offer. Once the offer's been made, the balance of power shifts. And now you as a candidate have power. And that's where asking to meet with the right executives, you know, I would constantly meet with, you know, junior level executives being hired into Nintendo of America, because I thought it was important that they understood me, my approach, my principles. But, you know, that's when you as a candidate have the ability to ask tough questions to make sure that the culture fit is going to be right, that the role is going to be right. That's when absolutely you have to ask for what you need.
Speaking of those moments, you rise the ranks, right? You're running a massive business at Nintendo. So part of the importance of doing that job well is being surrounded by an amazing team. And one of the ways to do that, as mentioned, is you have to choose people to surround yourself with. You have to make key hiring decisions. I'm curious, Reggie, when you think about those who you want on your leadership team, what are some of the must-have qualities in those people?
Sure. Well, this is a really provocative question in that, you know, every organization is going to have some base level criteria, right, in terms of different capabilities and knowledge sets. But during my time at Nintendo, we actually worked to define a key list of behaviors that we believed were critical, not only in defining success, because we ended up using these behaviors through all of our performance management tools, but it also drives culture. So, you know, things that we focused on, you know, having a global mindset, meaning, you know, thinking about the big picture versus just your little piece of the pie. And in this day and age, where everything is global, everything is instantaneous, being able to step outside your little world and understand the broader ramifications of any actions you take were just so critically important. So having that type of global perspective. We placed a high value on initiative, right? Taking risks, taking action, you know, that was important, in part because, you know, the video game industry moves so quickly that, you know, we needed to have a sense of moving forward in momentum. So we highlighted, I think at the end, there were 12 key behaviors that we valued, and made hiring decisions, promotion decisions, compensation decisions based all on these various factors. And again, you know, applying this to your listenership, every company, every organization has a written set of cultural type documents, you know, in the Nintendo of America terms are valued behaviors. But there's also the unwritten cultural elements that you need to understand as well, in terms of what defines success and how you can move forward. But these behaviors were just so critically important, and they defined the types of people we wanted on our team and the types of people who were promoted.
What was your interview process like? What questions, like some of the questions you asked to ensure that they exhibited, because everyone's on their best behavior during an interview, right? So how do you get past that and fully get to know them, their values, their behaviors, what they, I mean, you're trying to predict the future a little bit, obviously that's part of the deal, which is not, it's an imperfect science. So what did you do to increase your odds of finding people who are going to do and value the things that you did?
So when I was hiring, and again, I think it's important to separate out, me as the hiring executive for the next level down versus me as an executive in the process
Right.
for people deeper in the organization. But me as the hiring executive, I was hands-on throughout the entire process, meaning, the initial phone conversation that in some organizations might be done with someone in the HR function or in the recruiting function. Yes, that happened, but I was always then the next conversation
Oh,
because I wanted to quickly weed out, if someone, if I felt culturally they were not going to fit, or from a behavioral standpoint, a background standpoint. I was involved very early in the process. And part of that also was I want to respect the candidate's time, and I also need to respect my time. So hands-on involvement very early on. Once we would get to a small pool of candidates, my line of questions were, coming from very different angles. I would ask questions about, someone's background early in their career. Then I would jump to what it is that they're doing today. I would try and get at how they approach problems. I would give them current problems that Nintendo was facing and get a sense of how they would respond to those. And to be clear, I wasn't looking for the right answer, technically, if you will. I wanted to see how they thought. I wanted to understand the thinking. I wanted to see how they would communicate an approach, and if they could convince me, even if what they were trying to sell me on was not accurate based on the industry or based on the full knowledge that we had. But getting at clarity, getting at communication capability, persuasiveness, those were all things that I focused on when I was hiring for a position directly reporting into me. Deeper into the organization, my focus was much more cultural fit, understanding people's motivations, people sharing as clearly and as candidly I could our culture at Nintendo. And at that point, making sure that if they were going to join the company, that certainly from a cultural standpoint that they would fit.
You obviously have accomplished a ton, just from the Nintendo role alone, let alone some other parts. What are you most proud of what you accomplished at Nintendo?
What I'm most proud of is the fact that I was able to retire. And, certainly for, the last couple of years, the company did not miss a beat in terms of continuing to execute and continuing to drive the business forward. And the reason I'm proud of that is, first, what it means is that I had the right plans in place in terms of promotions and the bench of talent below me to be able to step into the roles in order to be able to execute and drive the business forward. So knowing that you built the team and that they were ready is something that I'm incredibly proud of. The fact that, second, the initiatives were in place. And, at this point, I'm 3 years retired from Nintendo. And so the plans that are being executed are not the plans that I left them. My playbook was for about the first 2 years. Everything else I'm reacting to like a fan in terms of the actions that the company takes. But knowing that the playbook was there, that they were able to continue driving the business forward, and that time included our time with COVID and all of the challenges that brought to bear. So I'm proud of the team. I'm proud of their execution following my retirement.
Why'd you retire? Feels like you had plenty of more years you could have done it and killed it. What made you walk away?
So for me, I wanted to help grow that next group of business leaders, to grow that next group of companies in a bigger, more profound way than I could as an executive at Nintendo of America. I mean, look, to put this in perspective, uh, I sat on the executive committee for Global Nintendo. I was constantly making trips to Japan. Um, I would have meetings in the morning with my European peers. I would have video conferences late in the day with executives in Japan. It truly was a 24/7 type of role. And I wanted to do board service. I wanted to spend time at Cornell University, which was so critical in my career trajectory. I wanted to be able to mentor young executives and to help them in their career. These were all things that I could not do as a senior executive at Nintendo. I needed to create time and space for me to do these things. The book is an outgrowth of wanting to touch people in a broader, more profound way. There's no way I could have written the book as a working executive within Nintendo. So for me, it was making the choice to leave something that I loved, but to continue impacting people and organizations in a bigger, more profound way by doing different things. And I'm loving what I'm doing now.
Teaching, I think, is one of the greatest tools in the world for learning. What's it been like as a teacher, going back to Cornell, helping out? I would imagine, given the type of guy you are, you're going 100% when you do it. What's that been like? What have you learned from that experience?
So my tenure as an executive in residence at Cornell was only 12 months.
Okay.
I continue to go back and interact with students and with faculty, but in different roles. I sit on different advisory committees, but throughout all of that process, what I did is I focused on sharing principles. I focused on sharing big thoughts that the students could apply to how they approach their coursework, how they approach their outside activities, how they approach their career management. It was sharing, my life principles. I shared principles around leadership and how to think about being an effective leader. I did a lot of small group sessions. I taught a session on esports and esports as a business, which was really interesting. So it very much was trying to distill some key principles and some key approaches for these students that they could apply ongoing throughout their own personal journey. It was incredibly fulfilling, and to this day, I enjoy all of those interactions with students. I've done similar work here in the greater Seattle area with the University of Washington. So it really is a passion of mine to find ways to give back in this way, helping students figure out what's going to be next for them.
One of your first acts in retirement was to deliver the commencement speech where your daughter graduated at Ringling College of Art and Design. And I believe you focused on your 5 life principles during that commencement speech. And the first one is, what happens to you is up to you. Own your journey. Can you expand on what that means to own your journey?
Sure. So these 5 principles have been honed and sharpened over, for me, 25 plus years. It's been a constant self-reflection on choices I've made, approaches I've taken. And when I talk about this principle of what happens to you is up to you, it comes from my own personal journey of having to figure out how to get into a great university, how to pay for it, how to own that initial series of choices and all of the choices that followed thereafter in terms of career change and things of that nature. And where this principle comes from is, this is hard work that you need to own, right? So for me, I was at a very large high school, 700 graduating seniors, 700 upcoming juniors. Guidance counselors were overwhelmed. I needed to figure out how to get into college. I had to figure out how I would pay for it. I had to figure out, what would help me in progressing on my journey after college. And I had to do it largely on my own. And it's not that my parents didn't want to help, but as a first generation American, they knew the Haitian school system that they were familiar with. They had really no understanding of the US school system, how to navigate that journey. So I had to own it. I had to make the decision of which colleges to apply and how to think that through. Given at the time, every college application had to be handwritten or typed out. There was no common college application the way there is now. I was from a very low income household. So, if it was a $20 application fee, it felt like a lot more than that at the time. And so I had to be strategic and I had to own all of those choices. Jumping all the way forward, the decision to join Nintendo was a difficult decision. And, I look back on it now and how wonderfully it all turned out. But at the time I was joining Nintendo was in a very difficult situation. They were being squeezed by, big global competitors in Sony's PlayStation and Microsoft's Xbox. The company was not on solid footing. And so it was a difficult decision that I needed to own and to be thoughtful about. So that's where that principle comes from, owning your journey and every decision you make.
For somebody now, and I'm guessing you get bombarded with these questions from maybe recent college grads because you're so connected to Cornell and helping others and helping future leaders. What are some general pieces of life/career advice you'd give to somebody a bit earlier in their career?
So I tell students, juniors, seniors in college, as they're thinking about their choices, I encourage them to go to organizations where there's a focus on learning and getting insight, information on how to develop your craft, whatever your craft is, whether it's a financial path, a consulting path, a marketing path. I reinforce that you don't know everything, and you're kidding yourself if you believe you know everything. You need to go into an organization that places a high value on teaching you skills that you're going to put into your own personal toolbox, and you'll be able to take with you wherever you go and whatever you do next. So going into a learning organization to me is just so critical. One of my other life principles is being open to alternatives, right? Knowing that alternative paths can get you to where you want to be, and don't close those off. For me, Procter and Gamble was an alternative path. I was going to be a banker. I was gonna go get my MBA and be in the world of finance, but P&G took me down a marketing and general business path that again changed my career trajectory, and it was a good thing I was open to that initial role. So being open to alternatives, teaching types of organizations, early on, finding great coaches, finding great mentors, early on, finding sponsors who can help you on your own personal journey. These are a lot of the points that I tell young people that I interact with in terms of how to think about their future.
Love it, Reggie. I know we're at time. I really appreciate it. I highly recommend getting the book, Disrupting the Game from the Bronx to the Top of Nintendo. Super entertaining, a lot of great stories, but also a lot of practical takeaways for you in your career. It's nice when you can kind of combine those two together. So part memoir, part practical application tool, playbook in a way. So really good stuff. Thank you so much for being here, Reggie. And I'd certainly love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words. The book truly is a labor of love, and it really does focus on being, both practical in terms of the advice and the perspective. I call them the so whats of my stories, as well as being entertaining. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Reggie.